Makondo was not a poor city, nor was it broken, at least not on the surface. The streets were swept every morning, the markets open at sunrise, and the palace stood tall at the center like a promise carved from stone. Drums echoed during festivals, crops grew in neat rows beyond the city gates, and travelers often said Makondo looked peaceful from a distance. But peace in Makondo was carefully manufactured. It was built on one unshakable rule, whispered from parent to child, from teacher to student, from guard to merchant. Children listen, children obey, children do not speak. From the moment a child could walk, they were taught that silence was safety. Questions were dangerous. Opinions were disrespect. Words, especially spoken by the young, were treated like sparks near dry grass. In classrooms, children raised their eyes, not their hands. In homes, parents corrected with looks instead of explanations. Even laughter was measured, controlled, softened before it grew too loud. The city did not need chains or prisons for its youngest citizens. Fear did the work quietly, efficiently, every single day. At the heart of this rule sat King Zuberi, a man whose name alone could still a room. He was not born cruel, or so the elders claimed, but power had sharpened him into something hard and unyielding. Zuberi believed deeply in order. To him, disorder began with noise, and noise began with children. He often said that a child's voice was like a river in flood, unpredictable, destructive, impossible to guide once it overflowed its banks. Under his reign, discipline was praised as wisdom, and obedience was celebrated as virtue. Teachers were rewarded for strictness. Guards were promoted for silence, not justice. The palace walls were covered in carvings of kneeling figures, heads bowed, mouths closed. When King Zuberi addressed the city, his words were slow, deliberate, heavy with certainty. He spoke of stability, of tradition, of protecting Makondo from chaos. And the people listened, because listening was what they had been trained to do. No one questioned whether control and peace were the same thing. No one asked what was lost when a whole generation grew up unheard. In the schools of Makondo, silence was treated as a subject of its own. Children learned it before numbers, before letters, before history. Teachers carried thin sticks, not always to strike, but to remind. A single tap on a desk was enough to erase a thought before it reached the lips. Lessons were recited by adults, absorbed by children, and returned only through writing or nodding. Mistakes were corrected without discussion. Curiosity was corrected without mercy. Outside the school walls, the city followed the same rhythm. In the markets, children ran errands without speaking prices aloud. In the streets, they stepped aside for elders, eyes lowered, voices swallowed. Even during emergencies, when fire licked rooftops or carts overturned, the youngest mouths stayed shut, frozen by instinct. The adults told themselves this was how order survived. They told themselves children were safer this way. But beneath that comfort lived something uneasy, something no one wanted to name. Silence had stopped being a tool. It had become a habit. And habits, once rooted, are harder to pull out than weeds. It was in this city, breathing this quiet air, that a boy named Sefi grew. He was 12 years old, thin, dark-eyed, and often overlooked because he caused no trouble. Sefi did not struggle with silence the way other children did. He accepted it, not because he believed in it, but because he watched it. While others focused on surviving, each day, Sefi noticed patterns. He noticed how teachers spoke kindly to guards but harshly to students. He noticed how palace messengers whispered lies while preaching loyalty. He noticed how fear traveled faster than truth, and how no one stopped it. Sefi spoke little, but his mind was always awake, collecting moments, storing faces, remembering words adults assumed children would forget. Sometimes, as he sat in the courtyard listening to lessons that allowed no questions, he wondered what would happen if silence itself was questioned. Not out loud, never out loud, just quietly inside. Makondo believed his children were empty vessels, waiting to be filled with obedience. But Sefi was already full of memory, of understanding, of a truth that had no safe place to go. And though the city did not yet know it, the rule that had kept Makondo calm for so long was already beginning to crack, not with noise, but with awareness. That awareness followed Sefi everywhere after that day in the courtyard. It sat with him in class, walked beside him through narrow streets, and lay awake with him at night while the rest of Makondo slept behind closed mouths. He began to understand that silence was not empty at all. It was crowded with things people refused to say. In the classroom, he watched teachers pause before answering questions they were never asked, their eyes flicking toward the door as if words themselves might be listening. He noticed how lessons changed depending on who was present, how truth bent slightly whenever authority entered the room. At home, his parents spoke in fragments, finishing sentences with gestures instead of conclusions. They loved him. He knew that, but love in Makondo was cautious. It was a hand on the shoulder instead of conversation, a warning look instead of an explanation. Sephiu learned early that adults did not fear children's voices because they were loud. They feared them because they were honest. As days passed, Sephiu's silence became heavier, not because he wanted to speak, but because he understood what speaking meant. He began to see how guards lingered near the school gates longer than necessary, listening, watching, waiting for a slip. He noticed how merchants lowered their voices when discussing palace taxes, how elders argued with their eyes instead of their mouths. Even play was controlled. When children gathered to kick dust and stones in the open field, their games ended abruptly if laughter grew too sharp, too free. Sephiu realized that Makondo did not only punish speech, it punished thought before it could turn into sound. Yet, in this pressure, something strange happened. While others learned to forget, Sephiu learned to remember. He remembered names, dates, overheard conversations, the way fear changed a person's posture. His mind became a quiet archive of the city's contradictions. He did not yet know why he was collecting these things. He only knew that someday they might matter. At school, Sephiu's teachers often mistook his stillness for obedience. They praised him as an example, a good child, one who understood the rules. But Sephiu saw what they did not. He saw the way one teacher accepted gifts from parents in exchange for better treatment. He saw another strike a student harder simply because no one was watching. He saw lessons rewritten to match the king's speeches, history smoothed until it no longer cut. Once, during a break, Sephiu overheard two guards talking near the water well, laughing about a decision made in the palace that would take land from families who could not protest. The guards spoke freely, confident that no child would dare repeat such words. Sephiu said nothing, as always, but the weight of that knowledge pressed into him. Silence had taught him to listen too well, and listening had begun to hurt. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with drama or warning. It came quietly, the way forbidden things often do. One afternoon, in the school courtyard, a teacher was repeating a decision announced that morning by King Zuberi. It was presented as wisdom, as protection, as another necessary sacrifice for order. The other children sat still, eyes down, absorbing without resistance. But Sephiu had already seen the consequences of that decision in the market, in the guards' laughter, in his parents' worried glances. The words felt wrong as they left the teacher's mouth, hollow and heavy at the same time. Sephiu did not plan to speak. He did not raise his hand. The sentence escaped in the way breath escapes a drowning man. The king is making a wrong decision. The courtyard froze. The air itself seemed to stop moving. For a heartbeat, no one reacted, as if Makondo needed time to understand what it had just heard. Then fear rushed back in, faster and louder than any shout. The teacher's face drained of color. Children shifted away from Sephiu, as if his words were contagious. Somewhere beyond the school walls, a drumbeat sounded, steady and distant, indifferent to the moment. The teacher did not ask Sephiu to explain. There was no argument, no discussion, no attempt at correction. There was only the rule, and the rule had been broken. Guards were summoned with a sharp gesture, their footsteps heavy against the stone. As they approached, Sephiu felt something unexpected beneath the fear. Not pride, not relief, clarity. He understood in that instant that Makondo's silence was fragile and that truth, once spoken, did not disappear just because it was punished. As the guards closed in, the city around them remained quiet, perfectly quiet, unaware that its most dangerous sound had already been made. That dangerous sound did not echo. It did not need to. In Makondo, silence carried news faster than drums ever could. By the time the guards reached the palace gates with Sephiu between them, the city already knew something irreversible had happened. People did not ask what he had said. They asked who had heard it. Mothers pulled children indoors. Shopkeepers closed early, without explanation. Teachers avoided one another's eyes. The palace courtyard filled slowly, not with a crowd, but with witnesses who pretended they were not witnessing anything at all. King Zuberi did not shout when he arrived. He did not rage or threaten. His calm was sharper than anger. He listened to the accusation as if it were a minor inconvenience, a stain to be cleaned. A child had spoken judgment. A child had crossed the final line. To Zuberi, this was not rebellion. It was infection. And infection, he believed, must be cauterized before it spread. The judgment was swift because delay would suggest doubt. The king spoke a tradition of discipline, of the danger of allowing young minds to question what they could not yet understand. He did not mention Sephiu's name often. Instead, he spoke about example and consequence, words that sounded reasonable when stripped of their weight. The punishment was announced not as cruelty, but as necessity. No blood was shown. No spectacle was needed. The act itself was less important than what it represented. Sephiu's voice was taken from him, not in anger, but in certainty. The city watched without watching, each person telling themselves they had no choice. Parents looked at the ground. Teachers folded their hands. Guards stood taller than usual, relieved that the focus was not on them. When it was over, Makondo exhaled as if something dangerous had passed. But what truly passed that day was not danger. It was courage. After that, silence changed its shape. It was no longer just an expectation. It became a reflex. Children stopped whispering even when no adults were near. Some forgot how to raise their voices at all, as if the muscles themselves had learned fear. In classrooms, lessons grew shorter, flatter, emptied of anything that might provoke thought. Teachers taught rules instead of reasons. Parents corrected behavior without explanation, believing they were protecting their children, unaware they were hollowing them out. In the markets, arguments vanished, but so did fairness. Prices shifted without protest. Land was taken without resistance. When theft occurred, no one described what they saw clearly enough for justice to follow. Fires burned longer because no child screamed soon enough. Accidents claimed lives because warnings died in throats. Makondo was quiet, yes, but it was a quiet filled with absence, like a room where all the furniture had been removed. Years passed, and with them, something subtle but devastating settled over the city. Decisions became careless. Leaders spoke, but no one corrected them. Guards enforced laws unevenly, confident that silence would cover mistakes. Elders remembered a time when children laughed loudly, when questions filled the air like birds, but those memories felt distant, almost unreal. A generation grew up believing that thinking was dangerous and speaking was fatal. And at the center of the silence lived Sephu, older now, his presence reduced to a shadow moving through familiar streets. He could not speak, but his eyes saw more clearly than ever. People avoided him, not out of cruelty, but out of guilt. He had become a reminder of what Makondo had sacrificed to feel safe. No one asked him what he remembered. No one wanted to know what truth looked like when it survived punishment. King Zuberi, meanwhile, ruled with increasing confidence. To him, the quiet proved he had been right. The city obeyed. The children complied. Order had been preserved, but order without correction began to rot from within. Advisors told him what they thought he wanted to hear. Reports grew vague, polished, incomplete. Without challenge, his decisions drifted further from reality. Roads were built where no one traveled. Taxes were raised where nothing could be given. Laws multiplied, but justice thinned. Still, Zuberi slept easily, believing control was permanent. He did not see that Makondo's silence was no longer submission. It was blindness, spreading slowly, patiently, waiting. And as the city moved through its days without voices to warn it, the cost of that blindness was quietly accumulating, preparing itself to be paid in full. Years of silence had hardened Makondo like stone left in the sun. Streets were neat, markets orderly, and the palace walls gleamed as though nothing inside had ever gone wrong. But the shine was shallow. Behind the walls, the city carried the weight of unspoken words. Decisions that should have been questioned went unchallenged. Mistakes multiplied quietly, like shadows at dusk. Crops were planted incorrectly. Disputes were settled unfairly, and the sick were tended too late. Children had forgotten even the shape of their voices, and adults had grown accustomed to correcting errors only after the consequences became unavoidable. It was a city held together not by wisdom, but by fear, and fear, however strong, has its breaking point. One evening, in the golden calm of a setting sun, King Zuberi awoke and discovered that the world had shifted without his consent. Light, familiar and dependable, was gone. His eyes, once sharp enough to read a message across the courtyard, now saw only darkness. Panic swept through him in a way he had never felt, for it was not the kind of fear he could command. Doctors, herbalists, and shamans were called. They came with leaves, powders, chants, and prayers, all performed with confident precision, but their skill, so effective for minor maladies, faltered before the inexplicable. Night after night, Zuberi's sight failed to return. The palace filled with hushed speculation. Servants whispered in corners, wondering if the king's punishment was divine, karmic, or simply a sign of the world's imbalance. For the first time, Zuberi was not in control. The elders of Makondo, those who remembered times before the law of silence, were the first to speak openly about the cause. They gathered in the palace courtyard under flickering lanterns, their eyes heavy with worry and regret. One ancient man, with a voice deepened by decades of knowledge, said simply, "The city has lost its voice. Until the words return, so too will the king's sight remain blind." Murmurs followed, as hesitant as the whispers of children, acknowledging the truth that had been ignored for generations. King Zuberi, though blind, understood more clearly than ever the weight of that statement. His control, his discipline, his careful orchestration of silence. It had all built a prison not just for the young, but for him, for everyone. He had thought silence was safety. certainty. Now, he felt how dangerous silence could be. Amid the panic, the memory of Sefi returned to the city like a quiet wind stirring fallen leaves. People remembered the boy who had spoken once, whose voice had been stolen by fear and punishment. Sefi, now older and still silent, had observed more than anyone had imagined. Every injustice, every hidden detail, every subtle shift in the palace and the streets had been recorded in his mind. A living archive of truth. The city's leaders, desperate and trembling, sought him out. When Sefi was finally brought before the blind king, the air was thick with the weight of years of unspoken words. The king's hands trembled as they reached for him, not in malice, but in a deep, unshakable need for understanding. For the first time, Zuberi recognized what silence had cost him. Not obedience, not power, but the clarity and guidance of truth itself. Sefi could not speak, but he could write. A simple quill and parchment were placed before him, and with deliberate strokes, he began to reveal the hidden patterns that had grown like weeds during years of silence. The palace fell into quiet awe as he laid bare the consequences of fear unchecked, of voices forbidden. The streets, the markets, the schools, even the palace itself. Every injustice, every neglect, every unchallenged mistake was written in unflinching honesty. King Zuberi read, trembling with each sentence, the weight of every choice he had thought justified. Tears, unseen by the city, ran silently down his face. For the first time, he understood that power without listening is nothing more than illusion. And as Sefi's pen moved steadily across the page, the king felt, somewhere deep in his blindness, that the cost of silence could no longer be avoided. The city, the children, and even he himself would have to face the consequences of what had been lost before anything could be restored. As Sefi's pen moved across the parchment, the palace grew still in a way it had not for decades. The walls, which had once seemed so solid, now felt porous, as if they had absorbed every unspoken word and were finally releasing it all at once. King Zuberi's hands trembled above the page, fingers hovering as if afraid to touch the truth, afraid that acknowledging would shatter the fragile order he had so painstakingly built. The words were simple, yet devastating in their clarity. They revealed the hidden cost of fear, the mistakes that had gone unchallenged, the lives quietly harmed because no one had dared speak. With every line, the king felt the weight of silence pressing against him, not as punishment from others, but as an undeniable truth. He was blind, yes, but Sefi's writing illuminated more than his eyes ever had. And in that illumination, King Zuberi saw the emptiness he had created, not in the streets or schools alone, but in the very hearts of his people. The court remained silent, witnesses frozen as the truth unfolded on paper. Parents, teachers, and guards alike saw themselves reflected in Sefi's words, their own complicity laid bare. No one spoke, because speech would have been inadequate. The words already spoken by the boy, even though silent now, carried a force heavier than any scream. The city had long believed that control was enforced by fear, that obedience could be manufactured by punishment. But as the king read, he realized that control without understanding is hollow, and obedience without voice is fragile. For the first time, Makondo's adults felt the deep, hollow ache of their own silence. The years lost, the truths ignored, the justice never served. And yet in that quiet, something else stirred, a recognition that restoration, though long overdue, was still possible. King Zuberi lifted the parchment, trembling, and turned to the people gathered in the courtyard. His voice, raw and unfamiliar in its humility, broke through decades of fear. "I was wrong," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with remorse. "I silenced you. I silenced truth. I silenced the very voices that could have guided me. And for that, I asked forgiveness." The courtyard remained motionless, but the silence had changed. It no longer weighed like chains. It was attentive, expectant. Children peeked from behind their parents, remembering voices they had forgotten how to use. Adults exhaled, some for the first time in years, as if the simple act of hearing truth aloud was itself a form of healing. The king, blind yet transformed by recognition, continued. "From this day, every child shall speak, every voice shall be heard. Let the law that bound you in silence be broken, and let the city remember the power of words." Sefi, seated before him, did not speak, yet the message was understood. The silence that had once suffocated Makondo now invited a rebirth. The restoration of voices was gradual, tender, and almost magical in its subtlety. Children began to speak, tentatively at first, voices small and shaky, as if testing muscles long and used. Teachers listened, parents responded, and guards lowered their heads, realizing that authority can now coexist with dialogue instead of fear. Markets filled with sound, laughter returned to the streets, and even the distant drumming of the city seemed lighter, freer than ever before. Sefi watched quietly, still unable to voice his own thoughts, but his presence was a constant reminder of the price paid for silence and the enduring power of truth. Where once his words had been punished, now they guided. The city had learned that voices are not just instruments of disobedience. They are life lifelines, connecting generations, protecting justice, and revealing hidden truths that no ruler can afford to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, King Zuberi's sight slowly returned, as if the city itself were healing him. Light returned to his eyes, sharper and more alive than before. Yet the king no longer sought control for its own sake. He learned to listen, to question, and to act with humility. Makondo, once quiet to the point of decay, was alive again. The children's laughter filled the streets, but now it carried wisdom, awareness, and courage. Adults who had once enforced silence walked beside them, learning once more to hear and to see. And through it all, Sefi remained a silent witness, his story etched not only in parchment but in the lives of everyone around him. He had spoken without speaking, acted without defiance, and in doing so had restored balance to a city that had almost forgotten what it meant to live fully and truthfully. In the end, Makondo remembered its lesson in a way that would endure for generations. The rule that had once governed the city, that children must be silent, was gone, replaced by the understanding that voices, even the smallest and quietest, are essential. Sefiu's name, though never spoken aloud by him, became synonymous with courage, observation, and moral clarity. Parents told stories of the boy who could not speak yet had changed the fate of a city. Children learned not only to play and to question but to listen to each other as well. And King Zuberi, humbled by blindness and truth alike, often walked the streets, eyes open but heart even more so, reminding himself and others that power is meaningless without awareness, and that the cost of silencing the innocent is a debt that time always collects. Makondo had found its voice again, but it had also found something deeper, the understanding that silence may hide fear, but only truth can restore life, justice, and light.